So we're switching to English because we're also welcoming an international guest now, even though unfortunately he's not able to be with us today. So if technology is with us, I hope that we will very soon see Philippe Crist on the screen, a good friend of mine, who is advisor for innovation and foresight at the International Transport Forum of the OECD. His work is focusing on disruptive urban mobility scenarios, and he's examining how car-based and active mobility, public transport and taxis must adapt to these disruptions. He's leading the work at the ITF on data science, how we can make good use of that data as well, but also how to bridge the gap between data skills with the public government versus the private sector who have it in their DNA, and what kind of policy and regulation do we need to move to a situation where innovation can be used in a positive way. His presentation will be looking at places of the future, faces of the future, spaces of the future, and aces of the future basically. So Philippe, I hope you're with us, and I think, Jeffrey, you have met Philippe as well, right? Not that long ago.
Yes, last time I saw you, Philippe, you were riding on a bike. We were having also an online thing in Shared Mobility Rocks, and you gave a presentation while riding on a bike, so that was very special. So I hope it will be, no, I'm sure it will be very interesting again to hear from you. And as I know, and you told us, you're going to give a presentation of like 20 minutes, and then you want to talk with the audience. Am I correct?
That's right, 25 minutes, and then perhaps have some questions from the audience.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting the International Transport Forum to speak to you today. I'm terribly sorry I can't be there with you. This is one of the lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that even though nations are opening up, workplaces all have their own policies in place, and we are still on a restricted travel policy within the OECD and within the ITF. The ITF, who are we? We're an intergovernmental think tank. We're a platform for our 63 member countries to think about how to develop, to foster, to guide better policies, better transport policies that improve people's lives. And we do this in collaboration, of course, with our countries, with civil society, with academia, with experts, and with industry. And that, what I said earlier about our mission, is really the core of what we're talking about today. How do we create better lives for people, in part through transport policies? So, as Karen said, when I was thinking about how to address this set of what I hope will be informal comments and suggestions based on the very technical, detailed research that we've undertaken, I thought of four main themes that I'd like to address. The first is places. Faces, of course, is a secondary theme. Spaces and ACEs. Automated, connected, electric, shared. Those are the four main themes, but when we talk about these, it's always in the context of the future. And so I'll finish talking about how all these come together in our cities and towns by talking about a bit how we anticipate and adapt and plan for the future, especially in an environment where uncertainty is increasing, as we see right now with the COVID pandemic. But first, let me talk about places. And here, I think one of the key questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is a city? What is a town? Well, these cities, these towns, are where most of the urban population lives in the world. Most of the world population lives. Medium-sized cities like Mechelen are, in particular, those types of cities that will see the highest population growth going forward. We heard 86,000 today, maybe a target of 130,000 in a few years. This growth is replicated around the world, and it really raises the question of what will cities, medium-sized cities in particular, like Mechelen, become, wedged as it is between Antwerp and Brussels, the heart of the types of flows that we see between those cities and between broader regions within Belgium and within Europe. What we know is that there will be an increase in demand for housing and an increase in demand for travel. And for medium-sized cities, this means an increase in big city, or what we've considered to be big city challenges, including congestion, unsafety and crashes on the transport side, inequity, pollution, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. These are all the things that come to mind when we think about what is a city. A city is a nexus of opportunity, but it's also a nexus of challenges that have to be addressed. If we close our eyes and think about a city like Mechelen, we probably think of the physical imprint the city has. We think of that imprint as it's developed over ages. Cities are buildings, they're infrastructure, they're monuments, they're physical and virtual marketplaces, and they are literally crossroads. And any casual observer, any person that's been involved in thinking about cities, or living in cities for that matter, or governing cities in the last 10 to 15 years, is aware that most every city, including Mechelen, wants to adhere to a slogan that has become pervasive in society. And that slogan is smart everything now. How can we create a city that is more efficient, that is self-actuating, that is thinking? This is something that we see established now in both dialogue around urban centers, smart cities, and around mobility, smart mobility. So it's worth unpacking that a bit. What do we mean by smart cities? Well, by smart cities, typically the idea that we have is that they're clean, they're hyper efficient, they're ordered, there's very little space given to unplanned outcomes because we've anticipated these and accounted for them. The smart city itself comes from a notion within architecture of the smart building, where systems are optimized to anticipate and act on sensory inputs to provide an efficient living or working space for its occupants. So there's this idea of smart buildings as a machine for working, a machine for its inhabitants, its occupants, just as the idea of the smart city is to think of cities as machines for living. However, there is a problem with that framing of what cities are. And that problem is that cities historically have never been attractive because, or only because, they're efficient. The cleanest cities, the most efficient cities, the cities where nothing out of the usual happens are not the most attractive cities, nor are those the cities that create a lot of value, because hyper-efficiency is not what cities bring to society. The value that comes from cities stems in part from the messy, sometimes chaotic, and oftentimes serendipitous and random mixing and merging of ideas, of opportunities, and of people. And this is the true wealth of cities. This is what makes them so durable, such a durable feature of human society. So what is a city? And I think a good place to start is to say that cities are faces. Cities are the sum total of the inhabitants of those cities that create value in the city, that find value in living in a city. And so I'll talk a little bit about those faces in the case of Mechelen, in the case of any other cities, any of the other cities that we've observed in our work with our member countries. So a few words about how we account for people in cities, and in particular in urban space and our past mobility choices. Now, over the past 100 years or so, this has been the face that we focus on when we plan cities. Men in cars, and they're doing productive work. They're going faster, they're going further. Of course, women also drive. But broadly speaking, it's the singular focus on productive commuting to 9-to-5 jobs that has shaped a lot of our transport and infrastructure decisions in the past. And with reason, because these are essential tasks and valuable uses of city space and time. But they aren't the only uses of that city space. There are other forms of essential and productive uses, socially important uses of that space that take place in cities and must be accounted for. And many who are no longer working, who are no longer actively producing economic wealth, still add value to our cities and should be accounted for, both for the older population and for the younger population that is developing their relationship with each other and their relationship in lived space. And in particular, the youngest of us all, those that are creating themselves through the opportunities that city space provides them, especially through play. This is an equally productive use of our city spaces, and it's essential to create resilient humans and resilient societies. So cities are multiple spaces. They're not singular, they're not monocrop, if you will, spaces. They're diverse. Those spaces serve multiple functions. And here, I'd like to start talking a bit about the way in which we have structured a lot of that space, especially when it comes to the way in which we have considered how to move around cities. Here, I'm talking about the spaces that we've designed for the movement of vehicles, the movement of people in vehicles, in speed. Not for all, but mainly for those that are able to access machines, able to use these machines, able to travel by these machines. And these machines have proven to be tremendously popular over the past century, so popular that we reshaped our cities for these machines. The car, it is perhaps the defining technology of the last century, and one that has brought tremendous social welfare gains. We should not forget that. It was a liberating technology and a compelling one because, at least when its users weren't too numerous, it created new opportunities to access work, to access housing, and to access each other. But as car ownership has increased, its benefits have eroded, and our understanding of the cost its use imposed on all members of society, all people in cities, especially on the substantial number of people not driving at any given moment, though that understanding has increased. Those costs relate to crashes, pollution, noise and congestion, and perhaps fundamentally and existentially to the contribution to global climate change. I want to be clear, cities and towns need cars, but they need fewer cars, and they need less and more efficiently used cars. The main thing we can say is that as cities and towns have catered to cars, they increasingly pushed people to the margins of public space in cities. And this is an inherent outcome of that technology itself. Here, when we think about humans and city space and mobility space in cities, we've seen that as city space has become more focused on speed and more focused on long distance movement, people have, as I said, been pushed to the margins. Now, here, all technologies have limitations, it's important to point out, and their broad uptake often comes with a redesign of human systems to account for those limitations. Cars are unsafe when traveling fast, when they're mixed with more vulnerable road users, so they require segregation. Cars travel fast, and so cities spread to accommodate this speed, to accommodate the opportunities that this speed creates. But by spreading, they make the city more difficult to live for those who cannot access cars, do not want to access cars, and do not use cars. The sociologist historian Ivan Illich called this a radical monopoly. This is where technology shapes society to fit its technological design limits, and thus makes that technology the only one that allows people to function in society. And space consumption is one of the ways in which this radical monopoly has expressed itself. Here, looking at both the dynamic space consumption, the space consumed while in movement, and the static space consumption, the amount of space that's consumed when parked or when stopped, we can see the difference in different uses of space by different travel modes for a 6-kilometer round trip, fairly common trip. Majority of all trips are less than 5 kilometers, and for 8 hours parking. So a work trip going to in an urban area. And we look at this with an indicator that looks at both the space that's used and the amount of time it's used, so meters squared per hour. And what we can see is that a person walking walks more slowly, 1.4 kilometers an hour. They consume space longer, but they take up very little space. A cyclist goes through space faster, so they consume less space moving, and they're also quite small, but they consume more space than a person walking. But what I like to point out is that when we start getting into faster and faster modes, so motorbikes and cars, we see an increase both in the dynamic space, almost 2 to 3 times as much space as a cyclist, for example, but a tremendous increase in the amount of static space that's required. That static space is space that can be put to other uses, but because of the technological features and characteristics of these vehicles, must be set aside for that specific mode. And these comes back to the idea that as these vehicles travel in our cities, they push out other uses of that space because they occupy that space. Now, when we look at cities around the world, and in particular in Europe, we've seen that a lot of space was given, a lot of space was taken by cars in city centers. And it's been nearly a half century where slowly that space has been clawed back to more diverse uses, more uses that fit the kind of uses that inhabitants and those that work in city spaces would like to see. But those spaces are still contested, and they're especially contested when we think about the curb, so where mobility space meets public living space. And here, for example, in Barcelona, we can see a number of uses of that space coming into the same area. So parking for two-wheeled motorized vehicles, cycling facilities, a curb separation to allow safety for those that are cycling and those cars that are parked and or moving. We see a shared bicycle facility in the back, rubbish collection, waste bins, waste collection, car parking, of course, car use on the street, and deliveries. All of this in the same area, all of this trying to access some of these same valued destinations at the curb. And we've seen with COVID new forms of uses, new forms of pressure on mobility space for other uses, other forms of mobility with the type of pop-up bicycle infrastructure that we've seen to accommodate and absorb those that are no longer traveling or no longer want to travel, at least in the present, in public transport, and for non-mobility uses of that space, including commercial use and in this case, dining and entertainment use. At the same time, we've seen an increase in the use of that space for parcel and freight delivery. Of course, that space was always used for delivery, but as we've seen consumption patterns change even before COVID, but accelerating during COVID, there's tremendous pressure being brought on that space, and changes as well in distribution patterns in cities, where we see the rise of different types of uses for ground floor real estate, including distribution centers for parcels in our cities. All of these changes are acting in the same space and are going to be challenges that we have to address going forward. Now, one of the ways in which we can address this is by thinking of new novel distribution technologies and models. But I think one of the things that we have to be clear is that because urban space is limited, especially in its core, we have to find a better balance that allows city space to work in all ways for its inhabitants and for those that work there. And we clearly don't have that balance yet in most cities around the world. So what role can technology play in addressing some of these challenges? Now, as I said at the outset, the International Transport Forum has done a number of studies, and I invite you to our website. You can see the range of topics that we've touched on, including automated driving, algorithmic governance, road safety, new types of data used for road safety and planning. The list goes on and on. But I like to give some top-level comments around how technology fits into these spaces, technologies fits into our cities, and how technology fits with what people want in cities. So here, let me just give you a brief history of the challenges that we face. And mobility in the city was never easy to manage, but it certainly was less complex. What we've seen in recent years is an increase in new forms of mobility and new forms of mobility distribution channels that we had not anticipated. And a lot of these distribution channels have been facilitated by the increased digitalization of our society, of ourselves. And this digitalization has infused both mobility space and city space. We know that automation of many of these new options is a possibility and certainly is being trialed, although we don't have any clarity on the extent to which and the time at which that type of automation will be ready for release into the wild outside of controlled pilot cases. But more fundamentally, we can see that artificial intelligence, AI, that underlines a lot of, or underscores a lot of these technologies and the way in which they work together is an increasing feature of urban mobility, both in cities and towns. But it's something that public authorities are generally relatively poorly prepared for. All of these trends, all of these modes are converging in our cities, in our towns. And this requires perhaps enhanced awareness and enhanced action on the part of public authorities and enhanced decisions on the part of citizens on how to welcome these technologies, how to guide these technologies to deliver the kind of spaces that people feel deliver and create value for our cities and towns. Now, at the heart of this convergence, as I noted, are automated decision-making systems. And there's a real need to better understand how to anticipate the impact that these will have on our cities and on our daily life. Our cities, and to a certain extent, our democracies, depend on having a code-literate population and code-literate governments, public authorities. Now, we recently published guidance regarding how this might be addressed in the report entitled Algorithmic Governance in Transport. And I'd like to encourage you to at least look at the executive summary, because these are important messages when we think about all of these types of technologies that almost all draw on this kind of automation. But speaking of automation, I think we need to talk specifically and think about how we think about automation of vehicles. Vehicle automation is one of those areas where automated systems may prove helpful to achieve public objectives, but only in the right context. And I'm going to share with you two pictures that I took at the ITS World Congress in Copenhagen in 2018, back when we were still traveling. And this is a cycle track. And for the purposes of that Congress, the automated technology that they were trialing was not ready to be trialed on roads. And so they asked during the time of this Congress for cyclists to step off of their bikes and allow, give space for the automated vehicles to travel in their space. So this is a warning, if you will, because automated driving systems are clearly not yet ready for our cities, and we don't know exactly when or if they ever will be, as I said. So here we face the risk of a new form of radical monopoly where we adapt our cities and our lives to the technical limitations of these automated driving systems. In the most extreme cases, we've heard suggestions that perhaps for these vehicles to function and to be safe, then people walking, people cycling will have to wear transponders in order to announce their presence to these systems. That would be a huge regression. But more fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves the question, if automation is the answer, what was the question? And if that question is relevant, is it the first, fifth, or 100th best answer to that question? A good example is road safety. We believe, many believe, that automation will contribute to better road safety outcomes. So if automation is the answer to how do we improve road safety, is automation the best answer? Well, certainly not today, because these systems aren't able to, if they're able to remove a lot of driver errors, they cannot replicate safe driving behavior. More fundamentally, is automation the first best answer? No. Fifth best answer? Probably not. We know a lot of things that we can deploy today without having to wait for technology to mature in order to ensure improved safety in our environments. What's lacking there is the political will. When we think about cities and connected mobility, seamless connectivity across modes can potentially improve mobility outcomes by improving the use of transport capacity and assets and reducing inefficiencies in how we travel. Now, as part of this connectivity, mobility as a service is seen as one way forward, but it has a concept that has yet to scale. This is partly because there is no established model for successful mobility as a service ecosystems, and because the common playing field that a well-designed regulatory framework can establish is often lacking. At the heart of the scaling problem is a lack of a common data infrastructure that allows to build a mass ecosystem. And we know that in Flanders, there's been a broad consultation to bring together all the stakeholders in mass to think about what that framework might look like. In the case of the Brussels Capital Region, just last week, we provided some specific guidance on how, among other things, to actually conceive of that data sharing, that data reporting framework. And I think this is one of the first steps, first bricks, if you will, that we have to establish before we start thinking about how can we create this broad ecosystem, or how might this broad ecosystem scale up. I think here, one of the things from a public authority perspective we have to keep in mind is we have focused on the mobility side on hard infrastructure. And going forward, there is going to be an equal responsibility to manage, to guide, to facilitate, and to otherwise oversee the deployment of virtual infrastructure that gives rise to this seamless connectivity. Electric mobility is an interesting topic because the way in which it has been conceived in the past has been to take a fuel-powered vehicle, car, truck, or van, and change the drivetrain and make it cleaner, not clean, but cleaner by using electric power. Now, what's interesting here is that that isn't the use case that characterizes electromobility globally or even in Europe. What we can see is that while electric mobility holds great promise, where it has so far created the most value is in electrifying light mobility. Two-wheelers, three-wheelers in China, meso-mobility vehicles, so these are quite small, light urban mobility vehicles, and push scooters, step scooters around the world. The sales of these devices, of these vehicles, has outstripped the sales of electric cars by orders of magnitude. Electric cars represent less than 2% of all electric vehicles, of the entire fleet of electric vehicles in the world. And so here we have to keep our mind open that these new technologies don't just allow us an opportunity to change what we do, they allow us a change and shift in how we think about what we do and what tools we use to do that. And finally, to what is at the heart of a lot of our work and what is at the heart of a lot of the people who are putting on this conference, shared mobility. We believe that shared mobility will continue to form a growing part of the mobility mix, but cities must be designed for this, just as we designed cities for solo car use in the last century. Now, what that design looked like extends beyond just the hubs that anchor the and service shared mobility fleets. It extends to the regulatory framework around shared mobility and to the way in which road and curb space is allocated. When we think about what role shared mobility can play in the future, we have to think about what cities we design or how we design cities to accommodate this shared mobility. And this is something too often that we leave off the table. It is not something that is left off the table in Flanders, and groups like Otto de Ren and others are working on developing hubs, mobile points, and e-hubs that enable the rise of these use of shared assets. And finally, I get to the future. And I'd like to say a few words about how we anticipate and address the future. A lot of this is based on work we've just done and a report we've just released looking at how we have to account for travel transitions. In the past, we've faced a double problem. We've expected that past trends will continue on into the future. And thus we've focused on extrapolating what we've seen in the past and then trying to accommodate that forecast in the future. In our future infrastructure decisions and our other planning decisions. Now, in the past, we saw a lot of traffic growth, and we expected and built our road networks to accommodate that growth. And surprise, naturally, our road networks both accommodated this growth and generated new growth. In essence, we created traffic because we gave it space. Now, this approach works really well. Don't get me wrong. It works really well when trends are stable, like growth has been in the second half of the last century. And I think what we can see going forward, though, is that assumption of stability no longer holds. It's no longer the case that trends are stable, both in social side, demographic side, economic side. And the pandemic is just one example of that. The further impacts as we go into the next decades of climate change will be another example of that. What we see is our ability to predict the future, forecast the future, is eroding under this uncertainty. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. We have had a relatively poor record as well as this uncertainty grows in picking up on outliers that may become important. Who would have thought 2 years ago that we have seen such a massive shift in the way in which office space will be used in an increasingly telecommuting world. Of course, we will come back to the office, but we don't believe that we'll come back in the same way in offices. And likewise, we see a significant change around the use and attractivity of ground floor real estate in a lot of cities, especially under e-commerce. What will these changes mean for future travel flows? We must become better attuned to those changes, to looking for outliers, to understand how to accommodate the future. And that means moving from a predict and provide stance to a decide and provide stance. Because what we did in the past was to decide that we were going to have one type of future. At least now we should think about what kind of future do we want and try to build, accommodate, and invest for that future. So when we think about the future, we need to scan our communities better, and we need to see what is emerging and canvas them more directly in helping to build a vision of where we want to go together. The future is already here. It's poorly distributed, as it's been famously said, and it's unconnected. But including all, we can see its outline emerging and encourage and accommodate the parts of it we collectively feel will improve our cities and towns' ability to improve our lives. And so I'd like to close by saying, what does all this mean in the context of the theme of this conference? Well, if I had to resume it to just a few words, I would say that the future of our cities and towns is what we will make of it, of how well we will appropriate and take control of that future. And that future isn't one based on smart cities or smart mobility. It is one in which people, you and I, will make smart use of technologies. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Philippe. It was very interesting, and it was that interesting that we didn't dare to interrupt you, and now we come to the time that there is no room more for questions. So I'm very sorry, but we are on a tight schedule, and I saw you have a meeting also. There was a pop-up, so you are late for your next meeting. But anyway, Karen, do you want to say something? I want to thank you because it was very enlightening for me.
Yes, great speech as always, Philippe. Thank you very much. And it's also good to hear your perspective, because it's also countering the optimism bias that we sometimes hear from the industry, and we really should think carefully about how we want these innovations to be introduced in our cities, and our cities should be setting the rules of the game and not the industry for that matter. So thanks a lot, and see you soon for sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Philippe.
Bye.